Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking to Tal Howard, professor at Valparaiso University, about his recent book, uh, Broken Altars, Secular Violence in Modern History, which challenges a lot of preconceptions about the role of religion in fomenting political violence. Dr. Howard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us what the main themes of your book are.
Well, I began writing the book in dialogue with all that's been written about religious violence since 9/11, and certainly, religious traditions have contributed to violence. But I really thought the big story of the modern era is violence in the name of ideological secularism, and that's sort of the general thesis is to try to take the spotlight off religious violence, again, recognizing that is a thing sometimes, but to look at the sort of the ideological roots and political manifestations in the 20th century of violence, especially to religious communities, done in the names of extreme or extremist secularist ideologies.
And so the worst perpetrators of violence in the 20th century were Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Maoist China, etc.
Yeah, I decided not really to deal with nationalism and fascism as much, but certainly one could argue that Nazi ideology was anti-religious or in some respects even neo-pagan. But in the book I make a distinction between three types of secularism. Passive secularism, which I is the benign kind, the kind I subscribe to, is more of a the Lockean version manifest in the U.S. Constitution and but also in other constitutions. But passive secularism is not the only form of ideological secularism. Combative secularism is another that I trace its origins to the radical stages of the French Revolution that's highly anti-clerical, sometimes anti-religious. But really, the big offender is Marxism Leninism in the 20th century, beginning with the Soviet Union and later Eastern Europe and Mongolia, but then with Mao and the Chinese Cultural Revolution, that's also quite devastating to many different types of religious communities, not just Christians, of course.
Now, that was true in the 20th century. Has it been a slightly adjusted story in the 21st century with arguably the ascendancy of radical Islam and the decline of Marxism Leninism?
Yeah, I don't want to exonerate different forms of religious or religion extremism for contributing to violence, and that's a fact. But I think there has certainly been a decline in the type of extremist violence that you saw in the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. But I think in China today, neo-Maoism has staged a comeback. The regimes of North Korea and Vietnam and Cuba still, have a adversarial relationship to religious communities, I think.
Do you focus mostly on domestic violence by tyrannical regimes against their own people? Or are you also factoring in external aggressive violence?
Yeah, primarily it's intrastate violence that regimes who come to power and have an ideology where where they begin to see the religious communities within their borders as disloyal, perhaps a breeding of political dissent, um, opposing other policies. But it's primarily intrastate violence within a regime.
And what are the most popular misconceptions of the last 50 or even 100 years about the role of violence in perpetrating, I'm sorry, the role of religion in perpetrating political violence and repression?
Yeah. Um, well, again, sound like a broken record here, but religion has contributed to violence in cases. But I think generally the narrative that the sort of highbrow, secular liberal journalism that we tell ourselves is that, once upon a time, religion contributed to violence and the Crusades and the Inquisition, etc. But modernity and secular modernity provided an antidote to that. But I think that's only true if you just focus on passive secularism. But if you focus on combative secularism and what I call eliminationist secularism of the Marxist-Leninist variety, the big story of the 20th century, I think, is extremist violence done in the name of secularist ideology.
And do these stereotypes about religion being a unique source of political violence, do they typically not make this distinction between the benign secularism of the democratic West versus the more rabid secularism that you focus on?
Yeah, that's part of my argument as well. It's when you don't define something precisely, it leads to imprecise perception. So I think there's a problem of not distinguishing between different types of secularism. These two, combative and eliminationist secularism, do not confirm that sort of narrative of Western secular progress. But I argue you have to have a global perspective. If you focus just on Europe or the North Atlantic, you'll see mostly varieties of passive secularism, with some exceptions. I do profile the Spanish Civil War and the Mexican Revolution, even the Turkish Kemalist Revolution in the 1920s of examples of combative secularism. So not Marxist-Leninist secularism, but eliminationist secularism. So to sum up, I would say it's a matter of definitions, but it's also taking a more global perspective of what are often Western imported ideologies that grew up in the wake of the Enlightenment and the 19th century.
In terms of religious violence, of course, we're very much focused on Iran these days, but the Iranian Revolution in 1879 really seemed to usher in a new age of religion-inspired repression and violence that we're still living in the wake of.
Yeah, I would agree that that would be an example of an extreme religious ideology in the Iran example. I do argue in the book too that it's sometimes extremist forms of secularism, begun in Turkey in the 1920s, then exported to many Middle Eastern states in the 20th century, that has sometimes precipitated an extreme religious backlash. So I don't want to say this. Uh, uh, the emergence of Islamism in the 20th century in its various forms is not purely just a matter of fundamentalist religion but has been a counter response to Kemalist forms of secularism and nationalism, but also in the case of the Soviet Union, the extreme secularist policies that were imposed in Central Asia as well.
And these extreme forms of aggressive secularism that originate in the French Revolution and
Yeah.
really took off early in the 20th century, is it safe to say they're now in decline, or is that premature?
Well, I think certainly it is moderated. We generally focus on 1789 and so the early French Revolution, but from after 1792, 1793, the French Revolution took an extremely violent turn, persecuting religious communities. There was even in one part of Western France called the Vendée Uprising that some historians consider the first genocide, which is essentially Catholic opposition to the excesses of the French Revolution. I think that extreme violence has declined, but I think you still see it. I mean, even today, I think there's a big difference between more Western Lockean views of religious freedom and French laïcité, secularism that has um, um, that's sometimes been a little more hardline, a little more confessional secularism, if you will.
And Marxism, Leninism, or adjacent ideologies that are totalist in their ambitions, can they be described as religions, or are they distinctly different categories?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In the book, I've benefited from the scholarship of um, uh, writers, authors, other scholars who do see in nationalism or in Marxism, Leninism, a type of ersatz religion or replacement religion. But I argue that sometimes that stretches the definition of religion too far, and we need to appraise uh, some of the ideologies that they're really trying to exorcise, get rid of religion from human consciousness. Certainly that would be true of someone like Vladimir Lenin. He did not see himself as founding a new religion, but overcoming all religions once and for all was his ultimate goal.
And so, what counsel would you offer thinkers on religion and politics, or those who are practicing statecraft, looking towards the future? How do we minimize political violence with the lessons that we draw from your history?
Yeah. Well, I would say that historical accuracy is important. Telling yourself the correct narrative of the past, and really simply just being a student of history and raising the question of why violence has been perpetrated. Again, I don't claim to offer a sort of a universal theory of why violence has arisen in the past, but I'm trying to offer a corrective narrative that I think, especially in the wake of 9/11, overemphasizes the religious origins of violence and political conflict, as important as that is. But a more accurate historical view is to recognize that various forms of secularist ideology have done that as well. And to come back to a previous question, one reason I downplay seeing modern ideologies as religion is that sort of confirms the same narrative. If you redefine these things as religion, and then you go, oh yeah, of course, religion's always violent. These things were religion too. Therefore, religion is the thing that leading toward violence. I think you need a better analytic category to understand, the types of violence, intrastate violence that I talk about in my book.
Do you see any evidence that of like historians, commentators, journalists are taking to heart the lessons that you give us in terms of the dangers of a rabid form of state secularism?
Well, the book hasn't been out long enough, I think, to make it into the hands of policymakers around the world. But my hope is that it will encourage, at least for those who are curious about history, to think about the causes of it, and especially, my one hope maybe would be to, in a few instances of the book, I talk about the emergence of some forms of religious violence in the 20th century is not wholly caused by religion itself. I mean, that's a whole nother question, is how exactly do you define religion, but has been as an extremist um, um, uh, counter reaction, if you will. So I guess the lesson for history often is the virtue of prudence, to be moderate, to be wary of radical and quick changes. I think this would resonate with Reinhold Niebuhr and some of the authors that you all at the Institute of Religion and Democracy care about. But to be a student of history and to proceed prudently, trying to take into consideration human nature and the many factors that go into any historical decision or any policy.
Well, concluding with a reference to Reinhold Niebuhr is a perfect note on which to
Yeah.
conclude in a conversation. Could you hold up a copy of your book?
Certainly. Here we go.
Professor Howard, thank you very much for this very insightful conversation about your new book, Broken Altars.
Again, thanks for having me on.